They made their god in a day. Not a metaphor, not a parable. A literal, meltable god, fashioned from earrings, anklets, and nose rings stripped off women, children, and men in a matter of hours. And they didn't even wait for it to cool before they bowed down to it. 40 days, that's all it took. 40 days after the most terrifying divine encounter in human history. After the mountain shook, after lightning cracked across Sinai, after the voice of the living God thundered the 10 Commandments so loudly that the people begged Moses to make him stop. 40 days after all of that, the same people took off their gold jewelry and said to Moses' brother, "Make us a god." And here is what almost no one talks about when they retell this story. God nearly ended them, not punished them, not corrected them. He looked at Moses and said, "Step aside, let me destroy them all. I'll start over. I'll make a great nation from you instead." Moses was the only thing standing between 2 million people and total annihilation. And the story gets darker from there. Before we go any further, we need to fix a translation problem. Because what you picture when you hear the word calf is not what the Israelites built. The Hebrew word is eagle, eagle. And yes, it technically means a young bovine. But the word doesn't carry the image of a fragile, unsteady baby animal. Commentators note that eagle could describe an animal up to 3 years old, an animal in the first full surge of its strength. A bull, not a baby. So why did the biblical writers use the word eagle, the smaller, younger form, instead of the more majestic word for a full-grown bull? Because it was a theological insult. Across the ancient Near East, bull imagery was the language of divine power. In Egypt, where these people had just spent 4 centuries, the bull god Apis was the living embodiment of Pta, the creator god of Memphis. The pharaoh himself was called Bull of Bulls. In Canaanite religion, the chief god El was depicted as a bull. Bull worship was the language of the divine everywhere they had ever been. So when Israel tried to build a symbol of divine strength, they reached for what they knew, the bull. But the sacred text refuses to give it that dignity. It calls it eagle. The little one, the junior one. The theological statement embedded in that single word is devastating. You did not build a god. You built a calf, an imitation of power. A small thing pretending to be great. There's more. The root of eagle, the verb eagle, means to roll in a circle. The connection to the calf was that grazing animals move in circuits, walking the same circular path around their feeding ground. Scholars note that the same root gives us magal, a circuit, a track, a closed loop. That image is not accidental. Israel, in this moment, was looping back, circling, returning to what they had known in Egypt. 400 years of slavery had done something to their imagination. It had made them more comfortable with gods they could see and touch than with the God who spoke from fire and cloud. The invisible God of their fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob felt suddenly unreachable. They needed something they could put their hands on. And the Hebrew word for what they built quietly tells us, that instinct will always take you in circles. It will always bring you back to where you started. Now let's build the full picture, layer by layer. Because most retellings of this story miss what was actually happening on both sides of the mountain simultaneously. Moses had been on Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. The text makes clear he wasn't just having a conversation. He was receiving the architectural blueprints for the tabernacle, the sacred tent where God would dwell among the people. He was getting instructions, so detailed they covered the exact measurements of curtains, the specific metals for lampstands, the type of wood for the ark. God was designing a house. For himself, to live among them. While God was planning his dwelling place for Israel, Israel was building a replacement for him. The people's charge against Moses is recorded in Exodus 32:1, with language scholars note, is deliberately dismissive. They call him Ha-ish Moshe, this Moses, or more contemptuously, this fellow Moses. The original Hebrew carries a distancing force, as if Moses has already become a stranger to them, an inconvenient memory. They don't say our leader Moses. They say this Moses, the one who brought us up from Egypt. We don't know what happened to him. They were done with him. They moved on in 40 days. Aaron, Moses' own brother, the high priest, the man who had watched God turn the Nile to blood, who had stood in Pharaoh's court and seen his staff become a serpent. Aaron collected their jewelry and built it. When pressed later, his explanation to Moses is one of the most astonishing moments of cowardice in all of Scripture. He said, "I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf. It made itself. I failed." He didn't say I was wrong. He invented a miracle to excuse his sin, and Aaron was not punished with the others. He lived. He went on to serve as high priest. That fact alone reveals something unsettling about grace. Sometimes the mercy of God lands in places that feel profoundly unfair. Now zoom out again. Back at the top of the mountain, God is watching. And he speaks to Moses with words that carry a weight most English translations fail to capture. He says, "Let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them." The phrase, "let me alone," in Hebrew Hanicha li, is not God expressing helplessness. God doesn't need anyone's permission. Theologians who have studied this passage carefully note that in the logic of the narrative, God is opening a door. He's giving Moses the explicit opportunity to intercede. He's essentially saying, if you speak, I will listen. And Moses does speak. Immediately. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't first go down the mountain to see for himself. He begins arguing with God on behalf of people who, at this very moment, are dancing naked around a golden bull. I want to stop here for a moment, because I've read this scene dozens of times, and every time I come back to Moses standing on that mountain, arguing with God for a people who betrayed him while Moses was in the middle of serving them, I feel something complicated. I've had moments in my own life where I poured myself into something, walked away to do something important, came back, and found out that in my absence, everything I built had been dismantled, not by strangers, by the people closest to me. There's a particular kind of grief in that, a grief that makes you understand, just briefly, why God said step aside. But Moses doesn't step aside. His argument is not emotional. It is theological and it is precise. He appeals to three things: God's reputation among the Egyptians, God's own investment in these people, and God's unconditional covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not begging, he's reasoning, he's holding God to his own word. The Lord relented concerning the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. That is a staggering sentence. The God who changes not, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The text says he relented, which carries the sense of breathing deeply, of reconsidering, of turning. It is the same word used when God felt grief before the flood. It is the language of divine emotion, which is why this passage has occupied theologians for 3,000 years. Moses saved them. His intercession was real. It mattered. If you have never read Exodus 32 in full, I'm asking you right now, pause this video and go read it. The whole chapter. It will take 10 minutes, and I promise you it will read nothing like what your Sunday school version told you. If this kind of deep, original language, historically grounded study is what you're here for, subscribe. This channel exists to take you past the surface into the text itself. Now, Moses came down. He heard the noise before he saw the scene. Joshua, who had been waiting partway down the mountain, told him it sounded like the noise of war. Moses corrected him. It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, it is the sound of singing. And then Moses saw it. The text says he saw the calf and the dancing, and his anger burned. The Hebrew says literally chara af Moshe. Moses' nose burned hot. In ancient Hebrew, anger is located in the nostrils, in the heat of breath. This is not a figure of speech. This is a man who went from cold to fury in a single moment of visual perception. He threw the tablets. The 2 stone tablets carved by the finger of God, inscribed with the 10 commandments. Moses threw them at the foot of the mountain and they shattered. This is not a tantrum. This is a legal act. In the ancient Near East, when a suzerain treaty was broken by a vassal nation, the tablets containing the covenant were destroyed. Moses was not losing his temper. He was making a judicial declaration: the covenant is broken. You have annulled it by your own hands. Then he burned the calf, ground it to powder, scattered the powder in water, made the people drink it. Think about that image. The God they had chosen, the thing they had stripped off their children's ears to build, the thing they had feasted before and danced naked before, Moses made them consume it. He made them swallow their own God. The theological violence of that act is almost impossible to overstate. It was humiliation. It was also purification. Then came the moment that sealed the day in blood. Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side?" The Levites, Moses' own tribe, came forward. And Moses told them, "Put your sword on your side. Go back and forth through the camp, from gate to gate, and each of you kill his brother, his companion, his neighbor." The Levites obeyed. By the end of that day, not by the end of a campaign, not by the end of a war, but by the end of that single day, 3,000 people were dead. 3,000. The text is not sentimental about it. It does not tell us their names. It does not slow down. It simply states the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. Scholars note this was not an indiscriminate massacre. Moses had first called for all who were on God's side to come forward and open amnesty. Those who came were spared. Those who remained, who continued to resist, who were the ringleaders and instigators of the rebellion, those were the 3,000. The Levites killed members of their own families to execute that judgment. And Moses told them afterward, "You have been ordained for the service of the Lord today, each man at the cost of his son and his brother. Their willingness to choose covenant loyalty over family loyalty was the act that consecrated them to priestly service for every generation that followed." But God wasn't finished. The next morning Moses went back up the mountain, and he made the most audacious prayer in the entire Old Testament. He said, "Lord, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book which you have written." Moses offered to be spiritually erased, to trade his own place in God's record for theirs. God said no. He said, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." God refused to transfer guilt. Individual accountability before God cannot be bargained away. not even by the greatest intercessor who ever lived. And then, after the killing, after the intercession, after Moses' prayer, God struck the remaining people with a plague. There was no clean ending. The resolution, the people, was spared total destruction, but they were not spared consequence. 3 layers of judgment fell: the sword, the rebuke, the plague, and the entire generation. Every adult who left Egypt would die in the wilderness before Israel ever entered the land. They got to live. They did not get to arrive. Here is what this ancient story is actually about. It is about the gap between encounter and transformation. These people heard the voice of God. They saw the Red Sea split. They ate bread that fell from the sky. They watched water pour from a rock. And none of it changed them enough, because none of it had reached the interior. The miracles were external, the idolatry was internal, and until the internal is dealt with, the external spectacular means very little. The golden calf was not built by people who had never met God. It was built by people who had, people who were bored with waiting, people who found the invisible God too demanding, people who wanted something they could see, something they could manage, something that would go where they told it to go. That instinct did not die in the wilderness. It lives in every human generation that has ever looked at the inconvenience of an invisible, sovereign, uncurvable God and thought, I need something I can hold. The last image of Exodus 32 is not Moses standing triumphant. It is not God's wrath contained. It is Moses the next morning telling the people, you have sinned a great sin. Now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Perhaps. The man who had just argued God out of destroying 2 million people, and the best he could offer them was perhaps. And then he went up the mountain again, alone, into the fire, for people who were already even then forgetting what they had done. That is the image. A man ascending into God, carrying the weight of the people who should have been carrying themselves. The tablets were broken, but Moses went back anyway.